Hello everyone, today we talk about the evangelization of Central Europe, the Balkans and Eastern Europe in general, looking a bit more at the perspective of the Great Moravia and of Khazaria, or at least at the Byzantine perspective of evangelization towards these countries, of course for broader political and strategic reasons, mostly connected to the expansion of the Bulgarian Empire, and of course of ecclesiastical policy, still of international in nature, given that at this point, as you know, the Constantinopolitan seat was competing with the Roman one for, in fact, the evangelization of these enormous areas, right, of Europe that may have been less populated in density than the West and the South, but they were still huge and lots of people and peoples properly. So entities that were exactly in these centuries, talking mostly about the 9th, the 10th, were taking form as polities, right? And that as such also triggered for themselves the necessity of conversion to this higher order that monotheism provided with, in terms of the hierarchies that were being defined in such in such countries. And we have already talked about the Bulgarian Empire. I think last autumn we made a kind of a broader introduction to the first Bulgarian Empire. Still have to talk about the second, and we discussed the broader religious policy of Bulgaria at that point. We also made multiple videos really about the Byzantine-Rus relations that still at this time were crucial, and arguably the most important, at least after the one with Bulgaria, if anything was next door to Constantinople, was this looming threat that the Byzantines would get rid of in a military sense only drastically with Basil II at the beginning of the 11th century. Made a couple of videos about Basil II as well, and hopefully we'll keep talking about that. But speaking specifically of Eastern Europe and the connection with the Rus, we're talking also about this other, in fact, non-European, ethnically speaking, reality. It was Khazaria that was essentially taking form, had already taken form. Actually, the relations between the Khazars and Constantinople date back to the 7th century. These were Turkic people, famously enough, that had settled at this point, created this empire stretching from the lower Volga, the Caspian Sea, to the Don River. And it was actually a power to be reckoned with. It would be significantly crippled and properly knocked out by the Rus later on, when they would in fact start on their own to consolidate, mostly from across the Dnieper and the Dniester rivers, their own principality, the Kievan Rus, and say developing in an axis that were mostly latitudinally from north to south, from Scandinavia to the Black Sea, as you know, and essentially representing later on that the most important interlocutor with Constantinople, and in fact arguably the greatest success of the Byzantine evangelical missions, even though the distance between the Rus and Constantinople would still be significant, given that even for how history went, we know that the Byzantines never really had, differently from Bulgaria, was conquered at some point, reconquered at some point, really a long-lasting contact or overlapping or expansion in those areas, but still, politically speaking, was crucial for Constantinople to expand its control, its influence on all these, in fact, myriads of peoples that inhabited the vast Eurasian steppes, mostly the Pontic region. That was the one where the Byzantines effectively controlled, also some ports in as far as Crimea, etc. And in fact the grain exports and so on, and so the trade was the same. even the relations with the Rus initially weren't positive. They actually came to pillage the suburbs of Constantinople, etc. Eventually, they became the great allies, and the evangelization of these people was a great success for Orthodox and so on. But they still kind of remained two different things. But this is to be read in the strategic need of Constantinople to at least exert a certain degree of control politically, and in part also military as a consequence, on this enormous amount of people that normally pushing mostly from east to west. I mean, the same Khazars as Turks were, a consequence of this in many ways. I mean, that since the 7th century, the Western Eurasian steppes were, in fact, Indo-European, historically from millennia, get Turkicized, because the ever more primitive peoples going towards the east were the more warlike, pushed further at various waves. The last ones were the ones of the Mongols in the 13th century, and pushed unavoidably from the Eurasian steppes and straight in the Danubian corridor, and therefore into imperial territory. And so Constantinople was obviously interested in, at least checking these movements. By the way, this period that we're going to comment is also one of the few ones where Pannonian power was vacant, because the Carolingians had destroyed the Outer Khaganate, and until the Hungar migrations and the compaction, in fact, of the Magyars in the Pannonian basin, there was a big gap politically and territorially that was being filled alternatively, and that's where, in fact, you wouldn't probably be surprised the same ecclesiastical policy played a role by the Franks, mostly the Eastern Franks. We can't say the Bulgarians at this point, even though what's the deal? The Bulgars were this kind of mostly Turkic people coming from, in fact, from the Eurasian steppes, but effectively they would be Bulgarians because the Slavic majority would also make of this country like even a Slavic-speaking one, differently from, for example, Hungary, that still speaks an Ugro-Finnic language, in spite of the fact that even ethnically, of course, the conquerors were the minority, at least in that single wave. But the Huns, the Avars, probably left a mark even in that regard, ethno-linguistically. In any case, that's another issue. We're talking about enormous, vast plains, because Bulgaria was factually power-based in, say, south of the Carpathians, but it nominally extended some power over the same that, as you know, were kind of mountainous, forested area, rich in precious metals, though. So that's why the Bulgars would aim at that. That was difficult to control after all. Whereas in the west, the Pannonian plain north of the Danube, this enormous, effectively the westernmost part of the Eurasian steppe stretches, and so even just in terms of frontier area, as a flatland, right? Yes, it was in the Middle Ages, wasn't just an easy ground, where it was still kind of marshy, part forested in some surroundings. Terrifying place actually to be. Just the nomads could enjoy that because of the pastures for their horses, etc. But we are still in the early Middle Ages, so all the land clearance, the deforestation, etc., also the draining, etc., didn't exist, right? Europe was largely pretty wild still, but at least it was functional for this kind of raids, for this kind of idea. Let's say, okay, we are an Eastern Frankish king, more or less in control of, at least the expeditions that could be waged in the Pannonian area. Why not, right? It was populated. There were people. There were agricultural resources. So it was difficult for these powers to stretch so far, but they would, and they would try. And together with that, essentially extended the possibility of, exerting a sphere of influence essentially on these populations that, especially after again the destruction of the Avar Khaganate at the hands of Charlemagne, had remained without a real head. And that's where, in fact, it gets interesting also with other peoples. For example, the Serbians at this point were mostly under Bulgar pressure. They had their own problems entrenched as mountaineers and mostly in the western part of the land. But for example, the Croatians at this point were taking a form politically and even some ambition, and Croatia also was closer to Italy and so more exposed to the papal influence in the first place. Saxony had been just conquered by the Carolingians, so Christianity was expanding fast. Factually, the Franks at that point controlled all of Germany, succeeding even where the Romans hadn't. And there is this other important power that is Great Moravia, which in fact was mostly based in Moravia, but it encompassed some areas in the surroundings, also parts of Czechia, of course, and also in the southeast, reaching nominally again, and because of that local instability, as far as the Middle Danube, as far as places like Belgrade, right? So actually an enormous territorial dominion, namely, again, extensionally speaking, that was always kind of going back and forth. And this is, in fact, great part of what also the ecclesiastical policy is connected with. Not just because of the obvious, let's say, Rome or Constantinople wanting to win at that point this or that still pagan people that had essentially to choose which sphere of influence was better. Consider that at this point the popes had the Franks on their side, so the Great Schism had not happened, but at this point they were quarreling with the Byzantines. That there is the schism of Photius exactly at this point that was connected also with the pre-Macedon policy, also with the Bulgarians, etc. So it was a pretty messed up thing. But the other aspect is that politics and war were used to force peoples to not just to make this choice, but sometimes even to convert, right? And so, for example, the possibility of Great Moravia to stretch as far as places like the Middle Danube depended at that point on the game of alliances that occurred at that point between that and Bulgaria. Because maybe the Western Francia, given that the Carolingian Empire was collapsing, maybe backed that alliance against Eastern Francia, that bordered in the east with the Great Moravia, that kind of was still pagan and didn't want to be fall into the orbit of the Eastern Franks. And if the country was through, sometimes if the Franks wanted to push more against the Byzantines, it would ally with the Bulgarians, and this would put immediately, because of that compaction of power, the Great Moravians at stress. So it was an extremely complicated thing, and this whole issue actually weighing particularly on Constantinople, because as we know, in fact, the divides culturally between the, let's say, probably Byzantine world, the coastal, mostly Hellenic-speaking Christian Orthodox one, embodied by Constantinople, and the agrarian, continental, Slavic, and pagan one still was not at hundreds of years of kilometers of distance, was literally next door. I mean, from Constantinople to Adrianople was nothing. It's a few tens of kilometers. So it's and so the Bulgarian Empire was also, in fact, essentially intermittently, also because the internal stability was definitely not egregious at that point. There was an enormous debate in Bulgaria about Christianization and what the nobility wanted to do about that, because of course it was about conferring more central power to somebody in the process, because it had to control the church in a hierarchic form that would have to be paralleled by some secular government. And so the traditional egalitarian ideals of the nobility steps that obviously would always compete to come at power, but all the others would at that point coalesce against him, was enormous. But still, the Byzantines, in fact, would suffer from this back and forth. It would, as you know, wage military campaigns. It was a terrifying ground because the Balkans, I don't know, in southern Europe between, the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian one, or the Balkans, which is the worst terrain in absolute terms probably in the history of Europe, military history of Europe. It's something terrifying. And so it was always ambushes, guerrilla skirmishes, etc. And also considering the peoples there that had, these were all lands, by the way, that were consistently Roman in nature, right? At some point in history, then they had been kind of barbarized, mostly Slavicized, and so also the local economy had contracted, had changed, the imperial government had shrank. This is interesting, especially if you consider that certain areas, that this is especially evident in Serbia, what would become Serbia, etc., that especially all that encroachment of rivers in fact, Belgrade, etc., that the Serbians, in fact, didn't quite control at this point, was where the Byzantines would mostly revive their control, where they would aim at, with their armies, etc., because they could control, in fact, the waterways, and they would be open to the Pannonian frontier as well. So it was an extremely complicated game, but those were kind of the only civilized areas, and they were already Christian. I mean, there were churches. These were lands where, the Roman Empire had existed, churches had been built, people had been Christianized in some way. So in spite of the migration era that was mostly carried out by pagans, the idea of a church of Christianity and of Constantinople as a point of reference, especially in the Balkans among these peoples, was kind of evident, right? It was an opportunity also for them, in fact, to kind of centralize in some fashion. I mean, the Serbian principalities were nurtured within the empire, fundamentally, which is peoples who had settled there, and at least in forms of large, the pre-existing population. We don't know whether there were Sarmatians in origin. We don't know really the origins of what we call the Serbians or the Croatians in terms of, political identity, because it's obvious that there were pre-existing populace there, even pre-Roman, kind of Celtic, in part Illyrian, whatever. Also Latinized, because there was, and there still is in some those languages, some, even though they're Slav, they not much just of a Greek influence, but actually a Latin one. And probably who came to rule there were, this would be signified also by, ethnically speaking, by certain characteristics. You see, there is kind of a darker Mediterranean populace among these peoples, and then phenotype, etc. And then you have over-exceedingly tall, blue-eyed, kind of Pontic, Nordic-looking individuals, and you see, well, what is this about, right? Well, it's not just the Slavs, right? That's probably some, in fact, Sarmatian, or even kind of further Nordic population that came there. I was probably establishing military signaries that remained, also probably much in the warlike nature of those peoples throughout the Middle Ages, the kind of evident. There, unfortunately, these places are all radically underdocumented by, at least by Western European standards in medieval times. So it's very difficult to even answer. Nobody really knows. It's just conjectures based on names on some document scattered here and there, nothing else, right? Even genetics doesn't quite resolve problems in this fashion. In any case, there is this as far as the southern Slavs are concerned, and there are these other entities in Central Europe proper, in Moravia, that is far north, so between the in fact, in the westernmost Slavicide areas with the border with the German world, and even, as we've seen, in the longitudinal opposite, the steppes and Khazaria, and this kind of quasi-feudal realities, but still quite unstable ones of Turkic steppes peoples that would exert an enormous power. And part of the reason why the Byzantines were very interested in them was not just, of course, maintaining the control on grain supplies from Ukraine and the general, also kind of need of stabilization of the area. That the broader policy was to give more power, was kind of romanize these people, to give more kind of a more monarchic asset, so that you would have one single interlocutor and not many scattered clans. But the Khazars had been important because they were around even before the Muslims took over the Sasanian Empire, and they were already allied with the Byzantines, and they seem to have a lot of Middle Eastern connections. Persia remained there some kind of, region of interest for the Byzantine Empire for many reasons. And in general, we see this Middle Eastern influence even in warfare and technology. For example, even the Magyars that were Ugro-Finnic, and they came mostly not from the steppes but from the forests of some areas of Eurasia. By descending down in their migration, seemingly received an enormous Middle Eastern technological know-how that is in fact witnessed by the Magyar, for example, siege capacities, like even the ones that the Avars had before. And actually through the Danubian corridor and the Black Sea, a big trade connection with the Middle East as well, through the Caucasus and beyond. And so the Khazars as well were well established in the area. They were kind of an obvious interlocutor. Also, there is the issue of the Khazars, like being, what were they religiously speaking? And we see that, there is a huge debate about probably the Jewish nature of the Khazars. That is quite important, even just for Judaism, lots of reasons, even for the issues of the descendants from the 12 tribes, things like that, because many Jews of those that eventually would settle in Central and Eastern Europe were in fact the refugees from the Khazar Khaganate. They were superficially, monotheistic. In fact, there is a huge debate. We're not going to descend in historiographically, because it's very complicated, but yes, we do see that was probably some kind of official conversion to Judaism that even pushed, like from the elites down, some kind of Jewish teaching. There were Christians among the Khazars as well. There were Muslims among the Khazars, but it's fair to say that overall the general undertone was pagan, as always. In those, we're talking about the steppes in the early Middle Ages. But this conversion to monotheism had been functional for the Khazars exactly to put themselves in relation with the Byzantine Empire, with the Caliphate, and so with this big universal and neighbors, right, that kind of could help the Khazar establishment to kind of centralize further their own power, their own prerogatives. Famously enough, the Byzantine emperors at some point married with a Khazar princess that was naturally converted to Christianity for the occasion. But let's say those were kind of, again, peoples of interests that the Byzantines needed from their side to stabilize the whole Pontic area, as they could effectively kind of work like a wedge, blocking further pushes from east to west. Paradoxically, it would be the Rus from the west that would crush them later on, but that was the point. The control of the waterways and north of the Black Sea, from all the grains of the northern regions, were exported to Constantinople, that, as you know, had to after the loss of Egypt at the hands of the Arabs, had to essentially draw grain supplies from somewhere else, even to keep the Constantinopolitan mob happy, and the closest was the Black Sea, Crimea, and in fact the Ukrainian grain. So, as you understand, the political missionary activity of Constantinople didn't limit itself to just to the peoples of more immediate interest for the existence of the empire, such as, in fact, the Bulgars and the Slavs that were in fact blending with the Bulgars, or how the Serbs that were subordinated to the Bulgars between the 9th and the 10th century, but that had emancipated themselves from in fact the Bulgarian domination after the death of Simeon, right, and that had the great Bulgarian ruler that had entered more directly, in fact, in the Byzantine sphere at the time of Emperor Basil II. So the Serbs had this bit of back and forth from from the times of Heraclius, that were still kind of more Byzantine connected. Then the Bulgarians were kind of harassing, investing their lands, raiding, and they had to kind of, in a sense, negotiate more directly with them. They revived as other peoples in the frontier starting from the 11th century, and so also the greater importance that the emperors were given to, in fact, peoples at their frontiers to be accepted as emperors in the areas along the Danube, right, and to resist, in fact, against, at that point, the Hungarian power that had been consolidating and threatening the same right bank of the Danube, and therefore what was Byzantine was still inhabited by these peoples that thus found a common political ground with Constantinople. So the Byzantine spread of Christianity, however, went beyond the area of the southern Slavs. The missionaries that gave Slavic liturgy to the Bulgarian world were the disciples of two characters of Thessaloniki that were eminent for culture and political relations, the brothers Methodius and Constantine, the latter known with the name that he assumed as a monk, more famously Cyril, that would gain, in fact, the name to Cyrillic, that is, as we'll see now, this evolution of the Glycolytic alphabet. And Thessaloniki is an important center, not just because of the size of the city that would remain even just in high any late medieval times, essentially the only true city of the empire outside of Constantinople, and very often kind of with autonomistic tendencies because of the centralized position and the fact that, of course, Constantinople would rather like to protect itself and to fundamentally structure his own dominion within the empire as properly a Constantinopolitan seigneury over the other lands, and so not really caring about the emergence of other centers or giving them autonomies. And in fact, Thessaloniki at this point, and it's probably connected also to the missions of Methodius and Constantine who emerged from this area, was in fact attacked both by the Saracens, the Bulgars, and so this was an area that even just territorially was exposed to the external influence, and especially within mostly the one of the latter peoples in the Balkan hinterland. And so they were closer, even just this was the economy. The cities in the Byzantine world were, in fact, really the cornerstone of Byzantine control. The Byzantines could exert from them, and through the imperial structure per se, of course, a power over the hinterland that could be populated in this sense by other cultures, other ethnicities. You know that the Slavs essentially permeated everything of the Balkan hinterland up to Peloponnese, right? So the hinterland was kind of more agricultural naturally and more clanic than the urban reality of the empire, and it would be the area that, of course, as in all pre-industrial society, gave more contribution economically through agriculture, and so winning this interland peoples was greatly important, especially in a missionary perspective, given that, as we've seen, these populations were also of different religious background. Initially, they came as pagans, and so initially, especially the Slavic migrations in the empire are described a bit in a biased way as kind of this human tide that didn't really have any broader political strategic goals, and that somewhat peacefully settled in the area. The Slavs were actually more politically compact than that. It was a bit more of a Stalinian propaganda about the almost socialistic nature of the primitive Slavic communities. It wasn't really like that, but it is indeed true that in the moment, but this can be observed in part also at the early settlements of the Germans when the Romans still controlled them before Adrianople, that were kind of like coming as refugees with very often, knowing that it would have had to surrender some form of autonomy. In early medieval times, it was a bit different, but the situation was also a bit more difficult for both, meaning that these people really needed land, right? And that was imperial land. There was at least somebody to work it, and so for which the Byzantines still maintained the upper hand anyway, could exact taxes, tolls from, and so this thing had gone relatively easily, right? Given that, again, the core structure of the empire at that point was not really threatened, if not by other people, so were dramatically more dangerous. I mean, the Persians, the Avars, the Arabs, and so on. Now, so what I mean is that clergymen like Methodius and Constantine definitely came from a cultural background in that knew from centuries within the empire how to cope with the Slavs, with other peoples that could be assimilated and more effectively, also in terms of for the sake of the development of an ecclesiastical administration and a communication between, also in that case mostly with the Bulgars that were the most threatening element. Thessaloniki was just in the south of this domination, in a theory even encompassed by it, and so always on the frontier, hybrid in nature in some sort. So Methodius and Cyrillus had been sent by the Byzantine Emperor Michael III on request, properly, of the Prince of Moravia to evangelize the Slavs of that kingdom in competition with the missionaries that were coming at the same time from the Carolingian Empire. And there was, as we were saying before, a great struggle over this land, because there were always Frankish expeditions against these eastern neighbors that didn't show initially even a great cooperation in general. Not much to Christianization that was kind of weaponized by their own elites, of course, as always, to establish a real hierarchical power. In realities like the Western Slavic ones, that were dramatically less, stratified than the West, so they had properly difficulty to create something more stable as a domination. Saying Great Moravia kind of was existed for a long time, considering the time, but again, it was more, kept together by contingential motives than, maintaining a longer term territorial consistency, as you know. It surely witnesses, however, the important relevance of the Moravian lands, what also would become later the broader, the area that mostly the Permislids would take over. I mean, it's two different things, but still, territorially, it does actually overlap in important part. Also, those were important mining areas. They were also close to the Danube, so these were actually times of crisis because of the second invasions that would have struck. I mean, even the Magyars, as we've seen, will come into the Pannonian Plain, and the Saracens, the Normans, etc. But we have, in fact, kind of perhaps overestimated the detrimental action of those peoples, as opposed at least to the political and social compaction of continental Europe in those years. And in fact, all these machinations that actually were quite far ranged. Like, I give you that, yes, as long as the Carolingian Empire was standing, and also the Byzantines were, had recovered their strength after the Islamic blow of the previous centuries, there was a greater internationalization, right? So these missions were sent in hard times, but still the fact that they maintained some, they had some consequence on the longer run, and the evangelization did last for good in these lands. It's still very relevant because it shows definitely a political continuity. And as you understand, in the Moravian kingdom, there was a clash essentially between the Romans and the Constantinopolitans, and initially Moravia would be evangelized according to what would have become, in fact, the Eastern Greek model. That was reversed, however, later. This depends. We will make videos more detail to explain that. As also, it's true for the Bulgarian Empire that had actually accepted to be under the Roman Church initially, exactly to displease Constantinople. Right, at the end of the day, had to choose for that. But these are times in which objectively these people still could make an important difference, and that, even just evidenced by the ferocious competitions between Rome and Constantinople, because it's like those big changes in history, like, I don't know, even later on, still in terms of Christianization of Eastern Europe. Think about Lithuania, right? It was a time Lithuania, remaining up to the 14th century pagan, officially could side with the Russians, could side with the Poles, right? And the latter happened, which changed a big deal in European history altogether. So the evangelization effort was accompanied by the creation actually of new communicational means, given that largely the pre-Christian peoples in these areas didn't quite write, or at least they didn't write in in the same, for the same sake that more developed, kind of more, especially administratively developed and hierarchically and statally advanced cultures did, and so they mostly attributed to writing some kind of broader magical importance. It was the prerogative just of some specific individuals who had a specific role in society, and we're speaking of the invention of the glagolitic alphabet. That essentially, the term comes from glagolu, which means sound or word in the Slavic language, and this alphabet was elaborated on the base of the of cursive Greek, albeit actually, if you look at it, this is mostly what Cyrillic would tendentially evolve the line of, right? The symbols are somewhat quite distinctive. There was an admission of elements drawn from Hebrew and Coptic, interestingly enough. And it was created in this fashion because in Slav, and this is a problem that you see even in today's modern languages, like even the same English, that some pronunciations are strange. There are a lot of exceptions because this dates back to the time of the evangelization, when properly the alphabets that these peoples were to become literate with didn't really have these phonemes of the languages that they spoke. So there were some strange literal adaptations to this in writing that eventually came to affect Latin in turn. And so, given that Slav had this different phonetics and structure, a brand new alphabet was created. That true Cyrillic actually lives still today in many countries in Europe. And this alphabet eased the evangelization, the communication, first of all, the evangelization that, of course, occurred through the book and through the word, but it became also through, let's say, an instrument of common use for the literate people, for the literate classes, those that, again, in these countries were becoming also kind of more connected to the local princes, to the possibility of this establishing more permanent settlements with trade, with administration. So something that was definitely aimed also from the side of the Byzantines or the papacy, etc., to boost some kind of statal stability that the same localities were seeking for, and hence, the common goal for evangelization in the first place. And the glagolitic especially manifests the ductility for which, with the definition of Cyrillic, which was an evolution of its, became that prevalent writing in the vast areas of Eastern Europe, and so essentially claiming a success of the same script. Constantine, even before the Moravian mission, had been sent among the Khazars. This is forgotten. So the religious mission was not devoid of of success, right? Of course, these people were more distant. It was more difficult to cooperate with them. They wouldn't Christianize, as we've seen. They would, however, convert to Judaism. And it's still remarkable, however, because first of all, you also have to understand the times. There was, of course, a much better understanding of the world that they had, their own world, compared than the one we have of the same, of course, and in great part also of our own today. But it's the political cultural identity of a people was not immediately clear. Even geographically speaking, there were some general notions, and you can have even peoples that are very close to a country, but that maybe they're not developed enough, so nobody really cares. It's like saying, I don't know, the Roman Empire ignored the existence of Russia, but we have Roman artifacts even in the Urals, right? So it's double threat, but in different, with different perceptions of the same. So the general idea here is that the important was to, first of all, even just send these missionaries that were kind of even spies alike. I mean, they had some broader purpose than just the evangelization, but properly establishing a dialogue with the elites and the possibility of properly, saying what can we do together? What's the mutual benefit of this, right? There were incredible issues here at stake, properly about for example, the control of the population, because the evangelization contemplated also this, the living practices, etc. When the Bulgarians sent a mission to Rome, they had something like 117 questions that the Bulgarian government wanted to ask the Pope, in order that were quite practical in a way. It's something that if an average person today reads that doesn't quite understand, but for them actually were extremely important, extremely practical. It would affect some aspect of their political and social balance that they had to be extremely sure of. So they manifested actively the curiosity of knowing what religion was about, and what kind of rules it entailed, etc. And generally speaking, as you know, this was the evangelization and where another happened. And in the political line of contacts between Constantinople and the Khazars, that, as we've seen, dates back to the 7th century, is meaningful that the empire associated to its own customary wideness of horizons, especially in the diplomatic tradition, right, the same religious activity that was aimed at attracting peoples that were objectively far within the area of civilization that had its center in Constantinople. This aspect is crucial in many ways, because it opens, if you want, the sight to a lot of different aspects. First of all, as we were saying before, the Byzantines, and say what had been the Eastern Roman Empire, generally speaking, was witnessed an ethnographic revival towards the 6th century, especially during the Justinian Reconquest, and afterwards. Think about the Strategicon that we have read and commented often, and that shows actually a great observing capacity that basically couples the Roman pragmatism with Hellenic intellectualism in a unique synthesis of civilizational capacity, because the Strategicon was written at court. We call it the pseudo Maurice, because whatever probably was written those years at court, and of course everybody read it there. And it's not just like an ethnographic. It's not just a military manual that actually deals in great accuracy and realism, because we have made videos about that, analyzed these the various peoples that surrounded the empire, and that were constantly not just enemies of the empire, but were also figuring en masse as auxiliaries, but also properly their custom, their mindset, right? Von Clausewitz would have been, was probably, extremely pleased with this approach, because the judgment about these peoples is never, there is an immediate character of theirs, an immediate behavior, an immediate set of values that they put on the fore. Then after you see what's their army about, how they actually fight, and how to counter them, and etc. And this was, as you know, we made a video about early Slavic warfare, and we've seen there also how these same peoples were already, by the 6th century, understood limpidly by the Byzantines. It's true that the crisis of the 7th, of the 8th century struck heavily. It made Byzantine culture shrank, if anything, just territorially, into something that, probably survived especially to the Islamic onslaught, exactly because it was able to crystallize its own identity. But that the Byzantines would kind of pay for, together with a bit of the previous Hellenistic kind of classicistic legacy, that kind of idea of sense of intellectual superiority, that it's a double-edged sword in many ways, as by the 11th to 12th century, the West was already basically surpassing Constantinople in many ways. But this idea that the world was, after all, populated by other polities, by other peoples that were to be understood, that the empire had necessarily to cope with, and that could find new opportunities by interacting with, was extremely clear, right? And there were traditions also with the same lands, right? We often say, it's about the single peoples. And of course, the peoples are more important, their land they inhabit, but the same lands also have resources and have, some, let's say, they don't go anywhere. So nor Constantinople went anywhere. So there were some fixed connections, traffics, etc., that we can barely see in this. In fact, even in Byzantine historiography, this is called kind of Dark Ages, because it's the 7th century, especially, is the most widely underdocumented moment in Byzantine history. And even just by the nature of Byzantine literature, it's very difficult to read anything concrete about even this less trivial aspects, because Byzantine culture was configuring itself in a kind of ever more hypostatic sense, right? So something that was more like a model and an imitation of the same, and the perpetuation of the same process, rather than a limpid, unfiltered understanding or expression of certain things. So we know a few, but we surely know that Byzantine diplomacy kept operating. And what you immediately see, even just looking properly at a political map of the time, is being pressed by space is one thing, but we often overlook how much people traveled at the time, and especially how far people traveled at the time. Yeah, of course, the average peasant wouldn't travel much in general, but let's say the idea of moving was absolutely nothing strange in terms of those who had the capacity of doing it. Communication, intelligence was kind of immediate, right? There could be more or less there could be difficulties, of course, in communications and all you can imagine, but let's say the bigger the event, let's say an invasion, and the most obvious, the news, right? These signals arrive quite easily. Think about the merchants / spies, in fact, even same missionaries. And of course, missionaries were accompanied, that weren't just the clergymen, there were escorts, there were, in fact, businessmen, somebody that had to connect in other ways other than just the ideal, the religious one. These were true embassies, right? And what you see, especially in terms of the Romano-Byzantine relation, the Papal-Byzantine relation, is how, of course, you can. This is just an opinion. I was looking at the map just and reflecting on it. How, of course, different the types of peoples that Constantinople was coping with were compared to the West. The West was in a way, we tend to perceive it in early medieval times in Latin Germanic Europe as a bit enclosed within itself, like kind of this sleeping beauty that wouldn't, would wake up just in the time of crusades. It's a crudely ignorant mistake. First of all. Secondly, we look at the Carolingian Empire, which is not really something close within itself, and nor its economy, that for a long time has been mostly about materialistic, Marxistic, ideas. It's been believed to be in a way, because it was kind of anti-feudal, anti-seigneurial, if anything, for that. But nobody believes what even other thinkers like Pirenne thought, that one day one merchant woke up and saved Europe from the Middle Ages because decided to travel. That is bullshit, right? Economy, worked on a long range distance. We found lapis lazulis from Afghanistan in the darkest of possible ages. It means there was somebody who take them from there. I mean, of course, different passages, but let's say that traffic did exist, and we're talking about the moment of supposed greatest contraction. So, international traffics and transcontinental ones instead kept happening dramatically. Even, think about the Abbasids at this time. Think about paper from China to Spain. These were the centuries, and in fact, the great centuries of Islamic greatness that really also informed dramatically some models and certain, even famously enough, religious policies. Think even the iconoclasm, etc. We're not talking about that now, but let's say, and also the Khazars were connected to, as we've seen, other people, especially the ones that were dynamically moving in that Eurasian steppe Constantinople was interested in, mostly came under the influence of. But at the same time, it's coping with a power like Khazaria is somewhat desperate, in my opinion. Of course, there were specific interests that were intelligent, clever, and successful to pursue, right? For Constantinople, it was a great politics of success. But at the same time, what you see here in comparison is the projecting capacity of the West, that very far from being a unitary power, given that the Carolingian Empire lasted, relatively few and recollapsed and fragmented. Well, those are exactly the times in which the Roman Church and Latin Germanic Europe as a whole began essentially to act as one in international religious policy, evangelization, coordination, interconnection, whereas Constantinople was always the bulky, kind of statally centered empire that was trying essentially to survive amidst the avalanches of these people's this warlike horse riders from the steppes that came to threaten the same Constantinople, and there was always a mess after the other. So over the fact that, power like Great Moravia converted to the Roman Church and not to the one of Constantinople, and that generally speaking Orthodoxy would remain minoritary, and generally speaking properly part of these countries in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, etc., that would be the ones that developed the least historically in Europe during the Middle Ages and beyond. Frankly, was a success for Constantinople to kind of score that hit, but in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it doesn't really speak for a broader projecting capacity. Like already Western Europe was kind of emanating in a broader sense, to the point that we know the peak of the 13th century, where French and Venetian crusaders were fundamentally within Constantinople's city gates and establishing a Latin patriarchate there. And it's just, okay, yes, that's kind of half of a millennium later. Lots of stuff changed. But again, if we pick West and Byzantine Empire in comparison, well, things changed. Actually, they didn't both expand more than much than what they already were. Actually, the Westerners did more. The Byzantines kind of reconquered many lands that had belonged to them, but in proportion. Think about the Reconquista. I mean, the Iberian Peninsula is huge. Think about the same Central Europe, Scandinavia. These were all essentially papal at that point. Were not Orthodox, right? So the question is very relevant, right? You know, there was something in terms of projection capacity already in these 9th, 10th century that, in spite of the success of Constantinople and properly the range of relations, is of relative, reach, right? Again, probably the greatest success were the Rus, but even if they're not really incorporating that in the empire, the greater success, of course, was the destruction of the First Bulgarian Empire. That was never like a full recovery of the entire land of the Balkans altogether in central power there. It was actually a pretty messed up frontier situation where a second Bulgarian Empire from the same lands would actually reemerge in the east. So it was an enormous effort of a civilization like the Byzantine one that deserves an enormous, attention, greater consideration, there is no doubt, but at the same time, great fairness in the appreciation of, because it can't become a meme, right? I realize that most of the views I get about Byzantine history here, as most of the views I get about anything else, right? There are those few topics that always are, they're sort of an evergreen. It come from like a mimification of cultures, of realities of the empire, and do not really look at things in relative terms anymore, because that's the purpose of the meme in the first place, just to fix a standard kind of absolute diktat that doesn't leave much room for further critical inquiry. But the attention I had, the impression I got by looking at this reality seems to me quite clear in many ways. And the other point I wanted to make, which I don't remember, well, first of all, of course, that the steppes, Khazaria didn't turn Christian, right? It was just was an effort. Again, you're trying to convert the steppe. Think about that, trying to convert Germany or Central Europe. That is not the steppe. It's kind of half, if you compare to Western Europe, but it's something that is going to become Western eventually, or at least, properly in its Central Europeanness, it's going to adopt properly the Frankish models, right? And so it would kept emanating from Western Europe, essentially. And just looking at the sphere of influence of Orthodoxy later on and realizing that it wasn't probably this dramatic reach, right? Even especially, again, considering that the populations that were covered were also not really, let's say, particularly numerous, for example, that they would eventually take over some other powers in turn, right? At least in Central Europe, you have new kingdoms like the one of Germany, the one of Poland eventually, the same Hungary that, interestingly enough, albeit having an enormous Byzantine influence, will be Roman Catholic. Well, those are powers that are making power, right? Are even conflictual in term against Constantinople, right? I mean, think about Hungary, generally speaking, right? That's was not as strong, but it still was an enormous issue, right? And you can see in this sense the success of Orthodoxy among peoples like the Bulgarians, the Serbians, not the Croatians, though, as we were saying before, on the right bank of the Danube, as a sort of necessity of those same peoples. That is to say, what do you want to become like? If you're a Serbian, if you're a Bulgarian, like, do you want to, given the fact that the Byzantine Empire has somewhat asserted, is the dominant power in the region in the first place, do you want to be under, but it doesn't reach you very far, right? It can't stress, it can of course wage war against you, can even ravage your lands, etc., but it's not as dangerous because it contents itself of stability in a frontier decentralized position of the next door, just across Danube power like Hungary, that is viciously aggressive and imperialistic, and that will wants to tame you, and is also very capable in doing that. It is hell of a power. Well, you at that point, the choice of Orthodoxy is not really even much of an option, right? You would stick preferably as properly in a countercultural sense to what is opposed to your enemy, to your main enemy, and that it was in that case. And of course, the tribulations of the First Bulgarian Empire, the indecidedness of whether being Roman or Byzantine, let's say, Papal or Byzantine, shows, I mean, that was possible because at that point the First Bulgarian Empire was a hell of a power, and so could afford to choose which area to fit eventually. So we will actually see in detail at some point, hopefully, how this mechanism actually worked and what were the oscillations, the swings, again, because the local noblemen were again, it's not that they had anything in particular against Christianity per se, but Christianity meant a stable infrastructure, permanent administration, some bureaucracy, some personnel that would always work in parallel with a monarchy, with a secular monarchy that would increase its power at the expense of the nobility. So again, the only purpose of the nobility was to become that monarch, but as long, of course, as you were in that position, you had to counter the rest of the nobility that would be conveniently pro-pagan as long as it was too weak to not to be monarchic, as long as it was monarchic, it would be pro-Christian. Right, so it was not a religious problem. But I was told also by one of our dear followers that, for example, in Moravia, the change between properly the initial Orthodox, like let's call it Byzantine at this time because the schism had not happened yet. The initial Byzantine church and its infrastructures were literally destroyed, right? In what were eventually civil war. I mean, wars among the various clans, right, that were supporting this or that policy, and eventually, replaced with the papal church in the area. And the fact that Moravia was, okay, we're talking about Moravia later on, it's also Bohemia, it would become also, having been influenced essentially by first, actually, not just converted by the Byzantines, and even being the birthplace, because that's where Methodius and Constantine did the thing, of Glagolitic itself. So the actual script that in fact, today in those lands they do not even use anymore, because it's actually a Eastern European thing, and that's Central Europe today, and that is properly and definitely something opposed in a way, even just consider, of course, the modern contemporary history, so the legitimate repulsion for Russia and imperialism and all these things. But let's say up to a certain point in some areas, by the way, the question is, there was probably a triumph of a Western model that was seen in a time where really the West, again, invested by the Vikings, the Saracens, the Magyars, etc., could not really enforce it, right, and still succeeded over a more compact power, as it always remained, like the Byzantine Empire. And that tells the history of a cultural victory, of a cultural superiority, and of at least some, of course it's always relative, but it's relative to, again, the needs of the same people that locally wanted that kind of model to happen. Right, this inscribes itself also in the many videos we made about the evangelization of Europe. Just when it's yesterday, I re-uploaded an older one where we understand how this was possible among peoples that, of course, had always known Christianity by then. I mean, they were not, found, somewhere in the forest by the missionaries and never heard about the outside world. Were international peoples that knew about, they had always known about the empire since ever, right? Because the empire, by the way, was always there, one, right? So they understood that something had happened in between. There was something more a German empire and some more a Greek empire, but the church was still one, interestingly enough, because again, the schism had not happened. So you have actually two empires, but one single church. This is yet another thing to take in consideration when, again, you evaluate how this ecclesiastical field of choice was actually also about which kind of sphere of influence, let's say the Germanic Empire, Byzantine Empire, you want to follow. and sometimes not even, because we've seen in the middle, in between, these empires also couldn't really reach, right? Places like, I don't know, Moravia was never in the reach of the Byzantine Empire, not, in the frontiers of, as far as the Moravians stretch up to the Danube, middle Danube. They were more like German influence at that point, but Germany was fragmenting, like before the Ottonians took over, and exactly in those years. So it's what fascinates you is the initiative of these peoples. And so even though we have, in fact, before the Christianization, also properly less information, and most of the times properly no clue of even the essentials of what these peoples were and what they were doing, and what their political debate was at the point about concerning this aspect. The mere fact that these missions happened shouldn't be considered, again, in the neo-pagan phobically sense of the Christians came to, because they didn't come anywhere, they were just missionaries, right? One thing is Saxony, one thing is Moravia. Yes, it was some kind of threat from the Franks, but let's be honest, it was more like a deliberate choice. In part, the same thing was Bulgaria, because, by the way, if you didn't convert to Christianity, you were you would have missed an enormous amount of international relations. Like, these were, again, things that you couldn't miss if you were a state of some ambition, a power of some ambition, where you want to make even an imperial policy, like in the Bulgarians one, that wanted to be like make of the empire like a parallel to the Byzantine one. And so what this should be read like instead is, if these missions occurred, there was of course an active purpose from the side of the missionary lands, but there is also an active request from the other side. The elites wanted to play that card, to strengthen, to legitimize their rule. And this is valid basically for everywhere. So also the fact, again, coming back to the impression I got, that Constantinople had to reach as far as Khazaria to people like that to kind of spread the gospel, frankly, doesn't depose dramatically in favor of the projectional capacities in Western Europe, in the most advanced lands somewhere else, right? Yet a very different thing should be made also for the Christian-Islamic interrelation, because frankly, as we were hinting at before also about the iconoclasm, there was a huge influence between the Byzantine Empire, reciprocal one between the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate at this point, because of the same reasons that had brought, the Byzantines at winking at monophysitism in order to save the eastern provinces. I mean, the fact that now they were under Muslim rule, but didn't really change that much, because also the Abbasid Caliphate was an incredibly complex reality, much more easily permeable than the Byzantine one. It was instead a true, real, compact state. I mean, also the Abbasid one, but as far as just Mesopotamia went, but otherwise it was just more like a decentralized, namely power. That's another topic, yet another topic. We'll have to, in fact, resume some Islamic history soon, because as far as the Middle Ages are concerned, frankly, I made a lot of videos about that before, but didn't really happen very much often recently in the last year or so. Anyhow, for today we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.